We made it to Sabbath. Let's just say that. Praise Yah. And, all right. So let me open up with a blessing over the Torah portion. Let me get my things together and grab my book. In that kind of morning. But anyway, this week is special because normally we have one Torah portion per week, but this week we have two. So last year we had Torah portion Tazria, which talks about what happens when the Metzora, that is the leper, is declared unclean. And then the next week after that, last year, we talked about Torah portion Metzora, which is the cleansing of the leper. But depending on how the calendar falls in a given year, the dates of the calendar, we have two Torah portions in this week. Tazria and Metzora combine in this week, so we read both of them together. Let me open up with a blessing over the Torah portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kedoshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'cha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratecha b'finu u'fi amecha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzaenu v'tze'etzae amecha beit Yisrael kolanu yoda'ei shmecha v'lomadei tochatecha Lishma, Baruch atah Adonai hamalamet Torah la'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher bechar banu michol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made us holy through his commandments, and commanded us to engage in study of the words of Torah. Please, Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths, and in the mouths of your people, the house of Israel, so that we, our descendants, and the descendants of your people, the house of Israel, may all know your name and study Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, O Lord, who teaches Torah to his people Israel. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has chosen us from all the peoples and given us Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, giver of the Torah. Amen. Okay. Good thing Tom just walked in. I'm going to make Tom really happy right now. I'm going to make Tom really happy right now. I'm going to give you the point of the message. I'm going to give you the bullet point right now. My point today is not necessarily to extrapolate a deeper meaning from this Torah portion today. My aim today is to go through the Torah portion, draw out the general concepts, and address the key concept of tameh, which is unclean, and tahor, which is clean, and to challenge our mindset. Basically, it relates to your level of connection to God, or an object's level of connection to its source. That's the point. So, if you want to leave right now, you can. That's the snippet. All right, so the first verse in our Torah portion is Leviticus 12, verses 1. And it goes hand in hand with verse 2. It says, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Daber el bnei Yisrael lemor, Isha ki tazria. This is a woman conceives a male child and she gives birth to him. She is unclean 7 days, as in the period of her nida. That is her period. Also, we go to Leviticus 13. It talks about the laws of purity applying to the Metzora. It says, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'el Acharon lemor. He's not just speaking to Moses, he's also speaking to Aaron. Why? Because these laws affect the priesthood. It says, Adam ki yeva or basaro. If a man has in the skin of his flesh, set or sofachet, that is a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes sa'arat. He is to be shown to one of the priests. Why is he shown to the priests? Why can't he look at it himself? That's a question for you to think about. Another concept I want to get in your mind really quick is, and maybe this will encapsulate everything. Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, he said, had the tablets, this is the tablets of the Ten Commandments, not been broken, they would have been free. It's talking about the children of Israel because it talks about how the tablets on Mount Sinai given to Moses were charut, they were engraved. But the rabbis say, do not read charut, but read a word with the same letters that says cherut, which means freedom. And then the rabbis ask a question. They say, what is a free man? A man who is free is a man who is free from the angel of death, is the answer. So I'm throwing all this at you because I'm giving you a lot of information right now, and we're going to start putting the pieces together. Here's the structure of this week's Parshah. This is Tazria and Mitzorah together. It first talks about the laws of the birth. That is what happens when a mother gives birth to a baby boy or a baby girl. There is a structure that needs to be followed. Then it talks about what happens if you have Mitzorah, you have a Sa'arat on your body. You become a Mitzorah. And I'll explain the definitions of terms. Then we talk about the cleansing of the Mitzorah. What is the process for you to get reintroduced into the community? Did you know that houses also can contract Sa'arat? That's interesting. And then we finish with the laws of unclean discharges. If we have time, we'll come back to this. And we'll come back to that. But I want to address some concepts or misunderstandings we have. When I say unclean, I think of dirty sometimes. I think of unsanitary. I think of my room is not clean, so I need to put everything back in order. Or something is dirty, it's unclean, it's gross. If something's clean, the dishes are clean, now I can eat off of them. I think of it from a sanitary health standpoint, or even just how structured or organized it is. But really, I want you to do something. I want you to take the word clean and replace it with the Hebrew word tahor. And I want you in your vocabulary to replace the Hebrew word, the English word unclean with the Hebrew word tameh. Why? Tameh means to be ritually unclean, but not exactly. Tahor means to be ritually clean, but not exactly. These are Hebrew words. Tameh, which is up here, if you can see the dot. There's really no English equivalent for that word. Same with tahor. Unclean really does not even describe what that word means, and clean really does not describe. When God created the world in the 7 days of creation, He created everything so it would be connected to its source. God is the source. He's the source of life. When something is connected to God, it is ritually clean. It is ritually pure. If it is an object, we need to stop thinking of objects as objects. Because objects aren't just objects. This book is not just a book. This laptop is not just a laptop. You and me, we're not just people. We're made in the image of God, and these objects, they're vessels. And our daily life are vessels, if that makes sense. The level of sanctity, the level of tahor, right? It's more tahor if it is a vessel that can hold God in it. A sheep, right, is a tahor, it's a clean animal, if it can be taken to the temple and offered before God. It's a vessel for holiness, right? A pig does not meet the requirements, so it is not a vessel for God as much as a sheep. So you see where I'm going with this. So the question is, what about if we go back up to the law of the mother who gives birth to a child? Or the law of the Mitzorah, right? Sa'arat, I'm going to change terms too, talking about the leper. Because in our English vernacular, right, we call the leper a leper. But really, the biblical term for leprosy is different. It's sa'arat. It's an unknown skin condition. It's not a physical thing. It is a physical thing, but it has a spiritual source too. So when you had leprosy, sa'arat, you knew immediately that you were touched by God. Because the Hebrew word for plague that described sa'arat, the sa'arat is called a plague of sa'arat, is called negah. Negah means, it's from the root which means naga, which means to touch. So when you had sa'arat, you knew you were touched by God. So the question is, why does being touched by God make a person ritually unclean? If you keep in mind that if you are tahor, you are a vessel for God, right? You're a vessel for God. But if you are tameh, that's an object that is less of a vessel for God. The highest level of tameh is a corpse, a dead body. Why? Because that was something that was once alive. That was once something that had the breath of God in it. The objects with the highest level of uncleanness, or tameh, I'm going to stop saying unclean, are objects that were once alive that contained God's life in them, but now they're empty and void of God. It says, if you look at Leviticus 13, verse 2. I'm going to go back up. Leviticus 13, verse 2. It says right here, Adam ki'eh ve'or basaro. And it uses Adam. Why Adam? It could use gever, which means man. It could use enosh, which means man. The text could use ish, which also means man, but it uses Adam. On the surface level, we could argue Adam was created in the garden in the image of God. God walked with Adam in the garden. And because of his fall, he went from his state of walking with God to being separated from God. On a deeper level, Adam is the state of man when man is closest to God. Let me say that again. Adam is the state of man when man is closest to God. If he's an ish, he's just a plain man. But if he is close and walking with God and growing with God in his walk, he's considered an Adam. And the reason why a lot of people, most people did not get leprosy, even though they may have committed the sins of gossip or slander or even other sins that caused leprosy or tsarat, was because of the level of their connection with God. If I am walking with God and I'm intimate with God every day, and I start to go astray, that means my temple is starting to become a vessel that no longer houses God. God told the children of Israel, I am a jealous God. So because of God's love for me, what's he going to do? He's going to nagah. He's going to touch me on the shoulder. He's going to send me leprosy or tsarat. I'm going to wake up in the morning, I'm going to look on my arm, and I'm going to see tsarat starting to form on my arm. You know what that tells me? I need to go to the priest. In fact, I need to be brought to the priest. People have to bring me, because if I do this myself, I can't do it on my own. The Mishnah says that everyone may look. When it's talking about everyone, it's talking about the priest. What happens even if a priest gets tsarat? Everyone may look at and examine my tsarat if they're a priest, except for me. That means, because my eyes are blinded, because my eyes will make excuses, I can't look at my plague. I need someone else. The ultimate priest is God. But I need someone other than myself. I need to humble myself and say, maybe I'm not as clean as I thought I was. And because of that, God can then work in my life to purify me. What about the laws of birth? What about the laws of birth? And this is kind of going to challenge our concept that clean and unclean ties to sin. Because not always. Because remember, tahor is an object or a vessel that is clearly designated for holding God's light. And tameh is a vessel that God's light is not as welcome there. So why would a mother who's giving birth to her child be unclean? And to be honest, I don't fully know. That's something I've been wrestling this week in my study. But the best answer I got in just studying was that when we read Jeremiah, and it talks about how Jeremiah was formed and knitted in the womb, when we are still being born, when the process of bringing us into the world is happening, God himself is he intervenes himself in the process. That's why abortion is such a heinous crime. Because God is working in that baby's life to form and mold that baby personally. God does not delegate to angels. He does not delegate to other lower spiritual beings to work in that baby's life. He's physically touching that child in that womb, molding that child, and he has a plan for that child. So, the child is born. There's a lot of blood lost in childbirth. So that's part of a living source that died. But also, the child is now in the world, and God's no longer directly intervening, or should we think? And also, we don't know if this child will grow up in the plan that God has for it. So for 7 days, the mother's unclean. But then on the 8th day, the she's moved to a lesser level of purity, and she begins the purification process. Why? Because of the covenant. The 8th day is when the covenant's ratified. The baby boy is circumcised. So now we see the table starting to turning back. The child now has a plan. The child now is stepping into the covenant, so to speak. This is a child that's now, we didn't know for the first 7 days if it would be designated as a child that would walk as a part of the nation of Israel. But now on the 8th day, because it is circumcised, we know God's got a hand in this child. And then there's a purification process where the mother is reintroduced. And as you can see, tameh and tahor, clean and unclean, or unclean or clean, they really don't relate to sin. They do, but when we read tameh, unclean, and tahor, it's not talking about sin. It's just talking about what kind of vessel are you.
Does it mean like more prepared and unprepared?
Yes, and willing. How willing are you to be a vessel? Now, if you take a person, put it on a personal level, if I am a person who's more spiritually clean or unclean, a more spiritually clean would be a person whose vessel is empty to receive God, right? Someone who's more, the rabbis would say, on the impure side, is someone who's so full of themselves that they can't really hold God. But when it comes to like objects or people, the highest form of uncleanness is someone who's died. It's because they were once living. They were once a vessel, but now that's ended. The vessel's been shattered. Any thoughts or discussions? Yes. Give her a microphone. We need to pass microphones around.
Okay, so specifically, a woman being unclean because of nida is something that we've been tackling in our home the last few months, really studying and diving in. We look all throughout Torah and we see protections for us. Protections even for a human state. So why don't we eat pork? Well, he's got a bunch of reasons why, but we know that it's bad for us. And if you accidentally eat it, you're not clean. And there's something that you can do to take care of that. When you look at a woman who's had a baby, there are protections then for her in that time where she's unclean, and even in the time where she's becoming clean. There are protections for her. There is a change in what's expected from her. And I don't really want to teach, I'm not a teacher, but we have been digging in on this, and if anybody wants to chat about it, I'd love to chat about it. It's super fascinating. Even with the chair and the bed and all of that, it's so neat, the things that the Father's been showing us about that.
Please share more. If you want to feel like you want to share what you're studying, please do. Yeah. Share more. What you share helps everyone here. It helps me learn, helps everyone learn.
I'll just share the one thing with the bed and the chair. There is so much more to it, especially as we've been trying to walk it out. But with the bed and the chair, when Yah gave the instructions to the people, most people did not have a bed for every person in their family. They did not have a chair for every person in their family. And he actually uses the word sickness. When a woman is in her sickness, that is her monthly flow. There is a hard time on a woman. If you live with a woman and you don't believe that it's hard on her, she's a tough woman. And she really knows how to hide it. It is very difficult. It's taxing on the body. And I believe part of what Yah was doing was saying she is always to have a bed available for her and a chair available for her. She's to keep going about her duties. There's nothing that says, you don't need to cook or you don't do these things. If somebody's unclean, I don't want them cooking my food, right? They're dirty, but that's not the case. So it is a little different, but there should always be a place for her to sit. She shouldn't be in a position where she's asking somebody, hey, can you get up? I really need to sit down for a little bit, because that chair only she should be sitting in when she's in her unclean state, and same with her bed. So it's just one thing, but there's really a lot.
So you're taking it from the perspective of God's hand of mercy and love in that situation.
And the 7 days of being unclean after having a baby, but that 8th day is starting to change. If she's had a little boy, would she not want to be able to attend when her son is having his circumcision and be a part of that? I think that's also part of why there's a difference there too.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexi, because we spent the majority of our small group on Leviticus 12 this week. We just really dug into that. And two things that came up, and I do not take credit at all for all of these insights, but two things that really stood out to us as a group was going back to the garden. So, Adam is made in the image, and Eve is taken from the rib, and they were in complete unity with Yahweh. And then sin entered in, and there was that separation. And then one of the curses that Eve received was the curse of childbirth. So what we currently experience of childbirth and the pain was not part of the original plan, right? And so because of that sin, every child that Eve gave birth to would automatically be brought into that sin. And so maybe we were completely off, but one of our thoughts was that is another reason why there's a sin offering, because it's like this innocent baby, this mom is doing what she was created to do, which was to multiply, right? Be fruitful and multiply. Why the sin offering? But every child since Adam and Eve were brought in under sin. And so that covering was provided for them upon, birth. So that was a thought that we had. And then also something that stood out to us was that when you have these impurities, when you have, the body no longer working in alignment, it stood out that a doctor wasn't involved, that the priests acted as a doctor, right? Like they acted as the healer in that situation. And that really stood out to me this year for some reason. And so really going back to even thinking about when Yeshua walked the earth, how many times he talked to the Spirit, how many times there was a spiritual significance to the sickness, to whatever ailment happened. The woman who bled and hemorrhaged, her trust healed her. And so we just made all these connections to how many times are we going back to the Father for our healing. And there's nothing wrong with doctors, and there's a place for that, but just really looking at our spiritual lives is something that also could be a play, because we just see it time and time and time again, that the spiritual element of our lives does play a role in our physical well-being. So, yeah.
And before we pass the microphone to Mike, one thing I could say is going through a period, whether you're man or woman, where you are tameh, is actually a blessing. Because it can be a blessing because in that period, you are learning about, it's helping you grow in your walk. It's God touching you. Because if you remember, even in the case of the Metzora, it's someone who's affected by this, right? Is not someone who lacks a relationship with God. It's actually a sign you have a relationship with God. And it's a way of intervening in his life and making himself real to you. It's also this period of uncleanness, be it the nida, which actually means separation. It comes from the Hebrew word to separate. And also the law of Sa'arat, right? Their purification process follows that of the temple. It also follows that of the millennial plan, right? The millennial reign plan of God. You have a pattern of 7 followed by an 8th, right? The mother's unclean for 7 days, but on the 8th day, she is able to rejoin with her husband because the child's circumcised on the 8th day. With the Metzora, he when he's purified, he's brought back into the camp, but he has to shave and wait 7 days. He goes into a mikvah, and then on the 8th day, he's a full-fledged member again. But as he comes out of the mikvah, he looks like a baby because he's shaved all over. It's kind of like a rebirth where God's rejuvenating him. The 6,000 years we toil on this earth, right? A human toils 6,000 years. 7th millennium is the millennium reign of God, but in the 8th millennium in eternity, that is when the kingdom's finally here, when we're back in the garden. It's kind of interesting because in our lives, we go about following Torah. We go about following these commands. And it is so easy to become like the Pharisees, where this became rote. And we kind of lose the meaning, and we get caught up in the legalism. And I'm not bashing the legalism. My whole approach is embrace the legalism, but embrace it with the right attitude. Embrace it with the reality that, what can I learn? What does the legalism of Torah teach me about God? What is God teaching me when I open up the Torah and I have all these crazy commands that I don't understand? And how can God teach me? And when you live out the Torah, then you start to see how God's touching your life. Mike. Kevin.
I wanted to add something if I can before Mike. We were talking about healing, and I came. You talked about how the priest met halfway to the leper, and then you also talked about the vessel and that we needed to empty ourselves. And I thought of Philippians 2:7 that says, "For let this be in mind in you, which and also in our Messiah, who, being in the form of Elohim, did not regard equality with Elohim as a matter to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and came to be in the likeness of man. And having been found in the fashion as man, humbled himself and became obedient to death, death even as a stake." I think to myself, he became that leper. He came down, emptied himself for us. And you talk about that leper, and I thought of him right away, how he came for us. He met us the full way. He didn't go halfway. He met us the full way.
So every time we come across something, we begin to ask questions. One of the primary things that I try to do is find out the context. And so in the case of Leviticus 12, with the woman being unclean after having a son or a daughter, it makes a point of context here, and this whole subject of purity, ritual purity, and ritual cleanliness, it all came into place when the tabernacle was commanded to be built. And so Enrico and Joseph Good teach this, that a lot of the purity laws, and this isn't a dig at the Levites, but they began to take those laws of purity and cleanness that were put in place because of the tabernacle, the place of God's dwelling. And they took it outside that realm of the temple to their homes, okay? And there's a problem with doing that. So with that, in Leviticus 12, when it's talking about her time of purification, in verse 4, it gives a point of context. "And she shall then continue in the blood of her purifying 3 days. She shall touch no hallowed thing." The reason for these purity laws was, again, the institution of the Mishkan and God's presence. And if you remember that in chapter, if you back up a little bit, remember what Nadab and Abihu did. They came to the tent of meeting, the door, and they offered strange fire. They offered something that was not commanded. And so it was very important that when you approach the presence of God, you do it, you had to do it in a state of ritual purity, okay, because you're coming before a holy God. And so if you remember, so in chapter 10, it talks about how they offered strange fire. And then he says in verse 8, "And Yahweh spake unto Aaron, saying," I'm in chapter 10, Do not drink wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation. So this is right after Nadab and Abihu were struck down. And it says, unless ye die, it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. So approaching the tabernacle, the presence of God, required some very strict guidelines. And these laws of purity were the reason for that, okay? And in verse 10, that you may put a difference between the holy and the unholy, between the clean, the unclean and the clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all these statutes. And so I'll give one more example. Remember when King David and his men were I think they were on the run from Saul, and they were hungry, and that he needed some food for his men. And he come to the priest and said, "Hey, do you have any?" He says, "Well, all I have is the showbread." And of course, the showbread was holy, and so only the priests were allowed to eat it. Why? Because the priests would take special precautions in these rules of ritual purity to make sure that no unclean thing would touch a hallowed thing, okay, and which was, showbread was hallowed. But Paul, and remember David's response. He says, "Well, me or my men haven't, been in contact with any, with women, and so to cause them to be unclean." So the priest gave them David, after he confirmed that David and his men were in a state of ritual purity and not to violate the laws of touching something that is hallowed in an unclean state, he allowed them to eat it. So just putting things into context here, these were put in place because of the Mishkan and then when the temple came. But it wasn't meant to go outside, taking these outside. I guess you could apply them, for health reasons, but the whole reason was you don't want to touch a holy thing in an unclean state.
If you're not ready to be a vessel, is the point. If you're not ready to be a vessel. Nadab and Abihu did not empty them. Their sin was their pride and not recognizing what kind of vessel they were. And in that arrogance, one of the first steps to violating, God's house, the sanctity of his house, and even just looking at my own life, is we're more prone to do it when we kind of have an attitude of callousness, an attitude of arrogance, and we're not ready to be a vessel, to empty myself of myself. It's hard sometimes. But when I do that, I'm prepared for him. Nadab and Abihu, part of the reason why they did what they did was they wanted to be close to God. They wanted to do what Aaron was supposed to do. But they weren't Aaron. They had a role. And sometimes for us, our intentions may be pure or holy, but it's not what God wants, and we're not truly emptying ourselves. Who else? How much time do we have? Real quick, I'll talk about why I brought up that quote, "He who is free is truly he who is free from the angel of death." Because you look at the Mishkan itself was supposed to teach us, right? We're like children. We have to keep in mind we are children. And I work with children, so I know how they are. And we all are children, and we struggle to learn sometimes. So how do you make a child learn? How do children learn? Sometimes they play. When I was little, I would read about the Civil War, and I would go out and I would pretend I was out in the forest, pretending I was fighting on such and such hill on the Battle of Gettysburg, or my friends, and I would would play with toy soldiers, and you would play what we were reading or watching in a movie, or you, as a parent, right, if you're homeschooling your kids, you get your kids to engage all their senses when they're learning, and God's the same way. When we're learning about how to be a vessel for God, what does it mean to have my heart be pure before Him? Sometimes the best thing to do is if I'm using my hands, right? If I'm with my hands, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to eat this animal. I'm going to observe this if I have leprosy or sa'ara. I'm going to wait 7 days because my Father's teaching me about the kingdom. It's all about rebirth, the whole purification process. And I think this week is special because it includes both Torah portions, right? Because in Torah portion Tazria, you read about the Mitzorah. That is, the Mitzorah means someone who has sa'arat. What you do is you take the word sa'arat, right? And you add a M before it, it becomes Mitzorah, and it's a noun. But that's besides the point. You have this week Tazria, Torah portion. That's Torah portion 1. He becomes unclean. Torah portion 2, Mitzorah. It's his purification. To show you that many times we carry with us baggage, right? We carry with us vessels that maybe aren't capable of holding his light, that need to be maybe broken. Maybe he needs to break us a little bit. And from that, we have a rebirth process, right? The death, right? Death is the ultimate form of tameh. Tameh means I am detached from my spiritual source, right? Or an object is detached from its spiritual source. So that is being broken off. That's being removed from me. Death is being removed from me. Why is the Torah engraved? It's not charut engraved, it's cherut, which means freedom, because I am free from death. I'm a new creation. And that's the purpose of combining these two Torah portions, is to see how I'm becoming a new creation. God touches me because He realizes, He's making me realize, you have work to do in your life. King Uzziah, he did what Nadab and Abihu did. He took his censer, he offered incense. He was the Davidic king. He was not a Levite. He was not a priest. And because of that, he was struck with sa'arat. A person with sa'arat was supposed to go outside the camp. And this isolation time was actually God's way of giving. It's the way, kind of what parents do with their children when they say, go to the corner, have a time out. Go sit and think about what you did. And when you're ready to think about it, let's reason together and talk it out. And maybe you can change from that. King Uzziah never did that. We're told he died leprous. And each of us has an opportunity when we're touched by God, right? To draw deeper and closer in our walk with God, because really it's a bonding time. It's an opportunity. Sa'arat is not the end, right? Nidah, in that period of separation, is not really a permanent separation. It's a time so that when you come closer to God, right? When you are rejoined with your Father in heaven, when a husband's rejoined with his wife, right? It's a time of greater joy, right? Distance makes right? What do they say? Distance makes the heart grow fonder. This is kind of God's attitude here. There's a little bit of time where I'm thinking about how I should repent, but at the end of the day, I know that when it's over, this storm, right, that I'm going through, when it's over, God and I are going to be so much closer because I know He's doing a work in me. Anymore. Is that it? Do we have any more microphones that need to be passed around? I'm trying to talk less. All right, I guess we have no one. I don't see any
I
hands.
have something.
Yeah.
So what Alexi was saying about the chair and the bed, I remember growing up, and my grandma had this stool in her kitchen, and I always thought it was because she was old and she needed to sit down quite frequently. But with her explanation, makes me think that's probably why she had that stool, was because of her monthly cycle, and it is draining on a woman, and she needed to take a break while she was in the kitchen working. Anyway, it was just a thought that came to me.
Yeah. And as you read the Torah, it's like God thinks of everything. And the more you learn more about God's heart, you realize He's so intimately connected with us as His children. And there's in the Psalms 121 verse 5, I think it says, God is my shadow. God is my shade is probably the typical translation, but God is my shadow. It means that God is with me in everything. In Exodus 15, in the Song of Moses, it says, Yashir. It uses Moses and the people sang, but really that word Yashir, which means to sing, is future tense, but it also is causative, meaning they cause God to sing. Just by being His children, worshiping Him, God sings along with them. And whatever we do as believers, we do for Him, right? When we're being a vessel for Him, He's with us in that. Yes.
One more comment concerning lepers. It was interesting that you mentioned that a person with leprosy was touched by the hand of God. The healing of a leper was one of the signs of the Messiah that would come. So it fits the context very well there. That because if I remember right, when John the Baptist was in prison, and he sent and asked, "Are you the one?" And Yeshua told, send him word that. And again, I'm trying to remember right, but I think he mentioned the lepers are healed. So correct me if I'm wrong on that, but just one of the signs of the Messiah that was promised to come, that He would heal the lepers.
Now, can I add a comment to that? Maybe those lepers that Messiah Yeshua healed were touched by God, so they could be a vessel. That was a sign of Messiah. Yeah, one came back. All right. Let me close with a blessing over the Torah portion. That way we can move on. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has planted everlasting life in our midst. Amen. Thank you.